Hey there, welcome to GSPN Milwaukee Bucks feed. I am Ti Windisch, very excited to have a Gyro Step and Win in 6 Christmas collaboration. Doesn't really have anything to do with Christmas, but I am joined by my good friend Adam McGee to talk about the Milwaukee Bucks going 6-0 on their recent homestand. I believe 15 straight wins at Fiserv Forum. Should have looked that up before we started the show, but regardless, Milwaukee is on a winning streak, the longest in the NBA. They have been great at defending home turf this season, and we're going to talk about it. Very excited to do so. But first, of course, Adam, how's it going?
I'm doing well. It's going well. I believe I'm looking at the schedule here. The Pacers on December 6th, December 7th.
Not in
They
Fiserv.
beat. Oh, it's
In
saying on
Vegas.
ESPN. Oh, that's right.
In
So it
season
was
tournament. Yeah, that's
home
why
game.
that's why we're
That's it. You're
saying
right.
that's why we're
You're on
saying in
it.
Fiserv.
Yeah, I like it. You're on it. Yeah, things are going well. Bucks are looking good. They're not looking perfect. I think people should just get used to that and accept that and be like, hey, if they're looking good and they're winning and the offense is like pretty insane, good things to come as the season goes on. I think a lot of fun to watch right now. So beating this is a weird part of the schedule where it always looked as a stretch where they could kind of stack up some wins, but at the same time, some of these teams are pretty good. Like the Magic are pretty good, interesting team. Good test, and I think a pretty good performance all around. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about something else we've seen lately.
I think part of the reason that, especially earlier in the year, and I think there's still some of this sentiment, and I mean, listen, they're not as good of a defense relative to the rest of the league as they were. I think anyone with a pair of eyeballs and any familiarity with what Damian Lillard does versus what Drew Holiday does, and you could go down the line too. Campaign versus Javon Carter, right? A lot of changes on the perimeter defensive side. Wesley Matthews wasn't always available, but another very good perimeter defender who hasn't played. And the Bucks, one of their best wing defenders on this team, also hasn't played all that much, which hasn't helped. But I think in addition to those sorts of changes, it's just a different league. I mean, I don't know if you saw, I posted some stats this morning, but like when the Bucks, that 2019-20 team, which was their most dominant regular season team, I believe, in terms of point differential, that team had a defensive rating of 102.5, which led the NBA. And if you're not familiar, that means they allowed just 102.5 points per 100 possessions, which is about a basketball game. So it's a way to normalize versus points per game allowed and give you a better sample. So that was first in the league. I think the Raptors were at 104 point something, kind of right on their tail. This year, the Timberwolves' best number one ranked defensive rating of 107.6. That's only 4 seasons ago. But the best defense is 5 points worse. And the best offense, I think I'm looking right now, the Kings, I believe, had like a 117 offensive rating, 118.6, according to NBA stats last season. That was a record at the time for most points scored per 100 possessions. There are 5 teams currently scoring at least 119 points per 100 possessions. So the offensive explosion is definitely here. The Bucks are one of them, by the way, scoring 120.2, which again, if it wasn't for the Pacers and Sixers this season, would be the best we've ever seen. And of course, if they did it for a full season, we're only 28 games in, but still, I mean, there's a personnel change, there's scheme change. There's also a league change that is having a big impact on just the way scores look around the NBA. And I've seen some people try and do the like, oh, you can't keep allowing these 30-point quarters. It's like, well, the average NBA offense scores nearly 30 points a quarter now, so it's going to be kind of tough to avoid. It's been an interesting year from that standpoint. And the Bucks, I mean, they're feeding into it. They have a great offense too, but there's been multiple teams who are just absolutely blitzing every defense right now.
Yeah, and I think the Bucks were an outlier defense. Like at their best, it's not even that they were putting in numbers that look, kind of silly compared to what's the best mark in the NBA now. At that time, there were years where the Bucks were nearly a couple of points better per 100 possessions defensively than anyone else. So they were an outlier, and I think we have a habit of comparing them from a place where they were one of the best defenses the NBA has seen for quite some time. I think what we're seeing now, though, particularly as things are starting to look a little bit smoother and ramping up, by the end of the season, who's to say the Bucks aren't the outlier offense in the NBA? And that is a complete kind of switch, and we're getting used to that. And I think it's natural that I think Bucks fans are going to continue to look to the defensive end. Where, I mean, I guess it's worth noting things have got better, and it does fluctuate in game from moment to moment. But I guess something that's been true even from earlier points of the season, and where there was a feeling of greater struggle, this Bucks team has generally found a way to lock in and get it done defensively when it matters and when they need to within a game. And that might be all that matters when your offense is as kind of high powered as this one is. So we're in this constant state, and I feel like the likes of ourselves and probably all our listeners who are watching Bucks games all the time and thinking about the Bucks and talking about the Bucks are a little bit ahead of this. I noticed one prominent national media person come to the conclusion this week where it kind of finally clicked of, oh, you know what, the Bucks might still be good. They're just different. And it's like, yeah, well, everyone could tell you that from the moment the trade was made as much as anything else. Like, it's been clear this team can't be last year's team, the year before that, the year before that. These are not Bud's Bucks, and it's not necessarily down to the change in head coach. That's a factor in it, but the change at point guard is really the ultimate deciding factor. So they're a different team. We're going to have to win in different ways, and they're doing it so far. And I don't see real reason to believe they won't keep doing it for the remainder of the regular season. Obviously, when we get to the playoffs, it will be testing out a completely different approach that we haven't seen with these players when pressure is at its greatest.
Yeah, and to your point of, it's the defense has felt better lately since November 3rd. So I look at these stats all the time. That's when the Bucks started dropping. So the first 4 games, they had Brook all over the place, at the level, attacking stuff. Didn't work great. The rim was wide open. Since November 3rd, that's 24 games for Milwaukee. And all the stats are good, but 114.5 defensive rating ranks 14th in the NBA over that span. So again, they're not a top 5 defense even in this, run of better play, but top half, which is, I think there was a thought that they were going to struggle to get out of the bottom 10, and they are creeping up toward the top 10 right now. And it's still worth noting that Jae Crowder looks to be able to help that number quite a bit if he can maintain his early season play, which is a question coming off of injury. We will also see what, if anything, John Horst does at the deadline. But I love that we've been able to put off trade talk for pretty much all this regular season. Before the IST, I mentioned maybe we can get to it after that. I don't even think it's really worth talking about right now. The Bucks have not been in any rumors. I think Woj in one of his Threads Q&As was asked about kind of the Bucks and trading, and he's like, well, they don't have many assets, so not sure, which to me says there's just nothing out there, right? There's just not much rumor. We know the Bucks will look. Nothing's been out there, so we don't really have to talk about it too much. I think the defense has been getting better. I think right now it feels like rebounding has become a key Bucks stat, and it's been an interesting year to me because it almost feels like Adrian Griffin and the Bucks have kind of played whack-a-mole with their issues. It feels like there's been not even all just changes. There's just been different emphases that have helped a lot. So, of course, early it was putting Brook back in the drop, which should have probably been the base defense from day 1, but it has been since day 7 or whatever, and it's worked. So that's good. Then it was transition. And I think we get a lot less of these really ugly leak-outs for dunks. I know somebody had one. Bobby Portis had to foul, I think, Paolo Banchero after a missed 3. That was unfortunate in the Magic game, but it wasn't an endemic issue for the Bucks defense in the Magic game. Now it's the defensive rebounding. They just give up too many offensive rebounds, and that's still been a little bit of a struggle for them, but I think in this winning streak for sure, and really starting with the Knicks game in the in-season tournament, the Pacers game in the in-season tournament was bad. The big Pacers win at home, the kerfuffle, I think they were better. I think we've seen that start to change a little bit. They still give up too many offensive rebounds, and that one, I don't think that's not really scheme. That's just everyone has to box out. Everyone has to work hard to grab rebounds. But to a point you made earlier, it does feel like you can see a different level from this Bucks in like the fourth quarter. And they've brought it to the first quarter early in games too, which has been nice, but of like, all right, we'll be serious now. Like we'll defend now. We're going to get deflections. We're going to block shots. We're going to grab all the rebounds. And it can be a little frustrating, but it's also comforting. Like this is an old team. And the fact that there are, like when you can tell they know they have to do it, I think they've been able to do it by and large, which to me is encouraging, even if sometimes in the third quarter against Chicago or whatever, you're like, can we do it a little bit more right now? Can we ratchet it up a little bit right now? But, as we've said how many times, it is a December game versus whoever, and I think that is worth keeping in mind too.
Yeah, and I do think there's a couple of things. I think offensive rebounding is an issue. I thought something that actually I've noticed in a few different games this season and was kind of standout against the Magic too. They got some nice things going when Cole Anthony was in running the second unit, and they were moving the ball really, really well. I think that's something to watch with the Bucks. Kind of how smooth are their defensive rotations? It's always been something of an issue, I think, for some players in this team. That if you get them in motion, you're gonna find gaps. It's true for every team, but I do feel like the Bucks are maybe more vulnerable in that regard. If you come to the Bucks defense pretty, static, good luck. Giannis and Brook are just going to swallow any kind of shot attempts at the rim. So I think there are things like that which we could see improvement as the season goes on, and as they get more tested in this form. I continue to be impressed by Dame. Dame is a much better. I don't even want to be like more passable. He's a better defender than I thought. Like he is very, very solid. He's always engaged. He's just a pro's pro, and that works in a way that lots of other offensive superstar, offense first point guards, they wouldn't hold up in the same way. But he's more than able to compete there. And when we look at what has changed with the Bucks defense, we talk so much about the difference in Dame to Drew, and obviously Drew is so far beyond just being even a plus defender that there is a difference. But I think there is other elements to it as well. It's not just entirely on Dame or the differences in how those two guys play. I think the other thing, a point you made, and it's one thing, again, we spent so much time talking about what's different and having to come to terms with that and realize this is a different Bucks team that's going to win in different ways. It's nice when you see some things kind of rear their head and show true that we're familiar with. Stronger first quarters is one of those, because if you're a good first quarter and you're a good fourth quarter team, you'll generally work it out. I know we've seen the Bucks over the years sometimes be a catastrophic third quarter team and put themselves in games that should have been clear blowouts because of that. But I believe before the Orlando game, it was 5 straight games where the Bucks led after the first quarter. And although they didn't lead against the Magic, their first, say, 5 minutes were actually one of the best starts I've seen. It was beautiful, beautiful basketball. So many really nice plays. Giannis coming out aggressive and making shots. Brook getting to his spots with that really, really nice full court pass from QB1 Khris Middleton.
So good.
It's moments like that where you're like, oh, that kind of feels like the best of Bud's books as well. And I'm not opposed to just, if we can get to a point in the season where the kind of the combined feelings of what was good about old and what is good about the new books come together, I think that's when we'll really see them hit their stride. So I think improved first quarter performance, not starting games as flat, that's a big deal as well, because with the kind of players they've got, and with Dame in particular now, there's always a chance that this team is going to go off on a big run. If you're not putting yourself kind of behind the 8 ball to begin with, well, that big run is going to just open up the lead and you're going to be in control of the game more often than not. So it's nice to see some improved first quarter play, even though in the fourth quarter they've been really good pretty much all season.
Yeah, it's been a fun trend to keep an eye on, and fun is an operative word. When I was watching the start of that Orlando game, I was just, this is so fun. This is like some of the most fun basketball we've ever gotten to watch. I still, seeing Dame do Dame stuff, I am all the time just kind of like, how did we get here? What did we do to deserve? I mean, I know the Bucks have only, quote unquote, won one championship, but like, I just can't imagine a more fun turn for the Bucks over the last couple of years of like, oh, the defense is so good, but the offense, can Chris and Giannis do enough? And now it's like, Okay, I think they can do enough on offense now. I think they've got that sorted. But a good, and this is season long numbers, not just since they started dropping. But it's been a great sign to see their starting five in general has just been outstanding. So that makes sense that it coincides with the very start and the very end of games because, of course, that's usually when you use your starters. But in 256 minutes of Dame, Beasley, Khris, Giannis, Brook, the Bucks have a plus 18.4 net rating, which would be first in the league. 125.6 offensive rating, which would be best ever. 107.2 defensive rating, which I think would be better than the Wolves' season-long defensive rating. So to me, some of these numbers are actually almost shocking. I know the big 3 minutes are pretty actually similar to these. The Khris, Giannis, Dame minutes, probably because they've played a lot in that starting lineup when they've been together out there. But that group has defended pretty well. And then if you look at that group with Pat Connaughton in for Beasley, they've played much fewer minutes. They've been even better with a 95 defensive rating in 58 minutes. So I think we're seeing the primary players have really clicked and have really found success. And now it's about, okay, how can we stabilize that bench unit? What can we do there? And I think, that's a conversation to be had. And I think maybe if nothing else, maybe that's going to be the biggest trade deadline thing. I think some people would like, a player to supplant Malik Beasley to come in. I mean, that would be great if they can find someone like that. But Beasley has been really good and I think has really fit in a lot of important ways. And, there was like some talk, like, should Andre Jackson just hold that starting spot over him? I'm not there yet. I think Andre Jackson's had some awesome moments. The idealized Andre Jackson, what we hope to see from him in like year 3, year 4, absolutely. Right now, though, still too many rookie record scratch moments, and same with Marjon Beauchamp, to where give me Beasley, where some games he kind of floats out there, but he's also capable of literally knocking down 8 threes and kind of just ending a team by himself, especially when you factor in when he's doing that, you have to pay more attention to him as a defense. Okay, now what does life look like for Dame, Giannis, Khris? I mean, They found something with this group, and it's been pretty cool to see after a bit of a shaky start for Beasley.
I think the thing that's kind of impressed me most with Beasley, surprised me most too, is he seems pretty content to go quiet, which is a real strength when you are the fifth guy in your lineup and you're playing mostly as a starter. You're the fifth best player. We know he's really talented offensively. We know he likes the ball in his hands. We know he likes to shoot. Well, guess what? You're just not going to get a ton of opportunities to do all of that. So this is where it comes to fitting in, and where over the years, we've had so many fifth starter conversations, but ultimately it kind of hasn't mattered. And even when it has mattered and the Bucks have found someone who's a really nice fit, it's often because they've done very little and they're quite content to do very little and stay out of the way. And that's more necessary now with Dame than it ever was before. So I think what you've got to look at is I love everything about Andre Jackson Jr. I think he looks great. The team are not exactly thriving when he's on the floor. He is making good plays. Part of that might be he is a pretty weird player and he's kind of frantic, and there can be something very Marjon. He's having his ups and downs, and honestly, there was moments last night where he looks completely lost out there. Then there's other moments where you're like, where he throws down the dunk over Jonathan Isaac, and you're like, okay, well, that's fun to see. But I think Beasley is just steady because he's very comfortable and clearly, even from his social media, is just loving being on this team.
It's having a lot of fun on Instagram. Like he posts like he is one of us who's on the team. He is so excited every time. Like, check it out. I'm in the background of this photo with Giannis and Dame. That is not even a joke. Like, literally, he'll repost like. He doesn't say that, but you can tell it's like, I'm in here too. It's been delightful to see it, the way he's excited about this.
But that takes some selflessness, which I wouldn't necessarily have put down before we were watching him as, I think the greatest thing that's going to happen from Malik Beasley coming in is he's going to be really selfless. And he's just going to be a seamless fit with all the Bucks stars. It's kind of turned out that is the case. So the Bucks are at their best with him on the floor because he's really comfortable, and Giannis, Dame, Khris, and Brook are really comfortable playing with him. So I think that's very much worth keeping in mind. The other thing I'd say when we look at the defensive rating of the starting five and being, at a level which is comparable to the best mark in the league, and then we say, how do you stabilize the bench? the reality is the bench has been destabilized by injuries pretty significantly. All of Jae Crowder's time out, Pat missed significant time. You're even still in a spot where you're working out between. We'll throw Marjan in and just call them the rookies. We're still with those kind of that profile player where when Crowder comes back and if they can be healthy for quite some time and maybe work out some things like I'd be interested if Crowder is healthy for a sustained period and he's playing well, when they'll pick spots where it's like, okay, this is an extended Crowder spot. And maybe, Bobby, you're not going to play so much tonight in a way which is reflective of what happens in the postseason in certain matchups. And I think with the ability to just do some of that, pick and choose when it's appropriate, we could see overall the team's numbers trend in a positive direction defensively very quickly. Because the reality is, like, I think there is even something like, okay, campaign for all his flaws. I do have a thing when you watch the Bucks this year, and it's like, you still, every time I see Dame as a Buck, I have this like double take of it. It feels so weird. But to think of some of the teams we've had, and even like the version of Jeff Teague, to go right back to that the Bucks had running backup point guard, like campaign is such a solid backup point guard. You cannot ask for a whole bunch more of that. Does that mean that night to night you're going to be like, he is a great player out there, he's doing exactly everything? He's a backup point guard, so he's going to look like a backup point guard. You just can't really ask for too much more than that. And I do feel like there's something very kind of cohesive waiting to happen. If when Crowder gets healthy, he can stay healthy and the rest of the Bucks can stay healthy. And we see how that kind of more experienced bench crew, what kind of rhythm gets worked out with them, how Griffin and his assistants work out the rotation. But I do think injuries to that group, it's playing a big factor in the drop off in the defensive rating from our starters to looking down and being like, okay, well, what are the Bucks getting out of the bench, guys? And how is it changing the game for the worse in the defense then when they come in? There's reason to believe that could improve pretty significantly soon.
Yeah, I mean, I thought even the Orlando game, a couple thoughts on like the players you touched on. Pat Connaughton, who has not shot the ball especially well for another regular season, which has been unfortunate. We've certainly hoped to see that turn around. I mean, it did in the playoffs, so I think there's still reason to trust Pat's jumper, also years of sample before last season. But you look at everything else that he's been doing, and I find myself consistently like, oh yeah, that's what it's like to have a guy who knows all the spots to be in. Like you see on offense, Giannis comes over to a side of the floor. Pat is immediately clearing out down the baseline to go to the other corner and be ready to shoot a three and not be in the airspace. You see defensively, he is probably one of their best rotators. I was looking at like rimmed defense way earlier in the season. This isn't updated, but just to see like, you know, when the defense looked bad early, I was like, well, what does it look like when Brook is within 6 feet? Like, has Brook lost a step? How concerned should we be? And the answer was no. I mean, Brook is still excellent around the rim. Pat was up there too because he rotates to the rim and plays really good defense and picks up that rotation. Like, he is obviously not a clamps on ball defender, but just a guy who makes them very solid. And I thought some of their best runs in that game in the second half were Pat in there with a lot of starters and with Damian and Giannis, and then everything flowed, and they had some really excellent defense on Orlando, which is not a great offensive team by any means, but still, you know, the defense looked good. The process looked good. And then for Payne, like last night, I think he was 1 for 4. He's been cold from 3 after starting red hot. But you look deeper, and it's like, oh, he also had 4 assists and no turnovers in that run, and you know he holds down the fort. It's a vet minimum backup point guard you got even after Dame. Certainly, I don't think you can turn your nose up at the production too much. I think it's important to have a short leash with him because he seems like one of those guys who kind of like Bobby. Like there's some nights he just has it. There's some nights he just doesn't. And I will say I've been glad to see in this probably last week or two, Griffin has not ran him with Dame nearly as often. That used to be the rotation. Him and Dame, the extra playmaking. That's gone to more of like, I think we've seen both Jackson Jr. and Beauchamp in those minutes. And now with Pat back, I think he's probably taken some of those as well. So that's been encouraging to see. I have no issue if Payne's minutes are going to be 48 minus X, where X is what Dame plays. I'm not going to complain, even if he's not playing great, because he is a point guard. He does move the ball. He does set guys up. You know, does he call his own number too much sometimes? Maybe. Does he fight but not accomplish all that much defensively? probably maybe 2, but he is a true backup point guard, and I can certainly see why a coach would find value in that. And it's something the Bucks really haven't had, to your point, all that often, at least at that level. So hopefully, I think
they kept trading George Hill. I mean, that's the main reason they didn't have it. They had it for multiple seasons, and then they'd trade it, and they'd get it back, and they'd trade it.
Peak Bucks George Hill. I don't know if this team would have lost a game. I mean, oh my God.
That's a different kind of guy too.
Yeah.
I do wonder when I see like Bucks fans talk about campaign, I think is some of that like kind of shaded by what they remember, like when George Hill would just go out and score like 23 points and have 4 assists and no turnovers in like 25 minutes. Like that wasn't normal. The Bucks got some really, really good. Unfortunately, I think the peak of it was the pandemic year, where George Hill was at his best, and that turned for them from there. But
he was the best point guard on the team that year.
Yeah, that's true, and that's so kind of abnormal in terms of what you can expect from that spot. But I think like 14 to 15 minutes a campaign, he's very competent, right? And the ball isn't going to stick necessarily. It can stick with him sometimes, but it's not going to stick with guys who don't know what they're doing, who can't initiate offense, who aren't comfortable. And that has been a problem for the Bucks in the past. It's just having someone who is, an on-ball guard who can take some of that responsibility makes a big difference.
Definitely.
I think there's good bench stuff coming. Like, yeah. And even for the trade, I don't see trades. This is going to be, I feel like the opportunity could come up, but look, I won't say John Horst isn't going to make a trade, but I think the Bucks will be even more so than they have been in recent years, and they might be at the front of the queue with Giannis and Dame. If there is anything that comes at buyout market, and it's always a little bit more scarce than it has been in the past, guys are gonna want to go to the team with Giannis and Dame with a few months left and the chance to win a championship. And I do think that could be where reinforcements come. But as long as everyone stays healthy and like the starters are playing as well as they are with Beasley, I think you're kind of good in that regard. And you'll be looking for someone who brings you something different as a bench tool, maybe could slot into starting lineups. I'm not sure that's going to be via trade though. But look, there's a couple of months for that to change yet.
Yeah, my thing with trades continues to be I just don't think they'll do it unless it was a player who's either clearly better or fits much better than whatever they're giving up. And I just don't think there's a lot of those who would actually be available around the league. Like, I think it's a little divisive. For me, Caruso is one where I'm like, if he's actually gettable, then yeah, I think that does make a ton of sense. I think his defensive upside is good enough. But this group of guys, it's like Tybalt is kind of interesting to me, but like Dorian Finney-Smith, Royce O'Neal, these kind of guys who it's like, I mean, are they great defenders or were they the best defenders on bad perimeter defenses? So maybe their reps are that they're better than they are. Like, I don't look at DFS as a guy who comes in and like fixes the Bucks defense and whatever needs to be fixed. But you know what I mean? Like it makes sense, but I just, so in a trade like that, it's Pat or Bobby, and you probably have to throw in a pick because I don't know why Brooklyn in this case wants to otherwise. How much do the Bucks want to throw on top of Pat to turn him into Dorian Finney-Smith when you have Jae Crowder coming back in 3 weeks? Like,
I like Dorian Finney-Smith. I don't think you do that. No, yeah. And you've seen Pat perform in the playoffs too in different ways where you might just have enough belief in that and the trade-off isn't there. Bobby would be a different story. I think that's for a whole host of reasons. That's a tough trade to make. But even just from what you're doing for your roster,
yeah,
Jae Crowder would have to be healthy and playing really well, and you'd still be like, we're going to be on the small side.
Way too small.
So, I mean, that's a tough one. I was going to ask, and you kind of got out in front of it. Like, I think it's easy to say, like, oh, if Caruso is available, but I think the Bucks are in a spot, obviously not having a whole bunch of draft capital, that you're giving away you're going to create another opening in your rotation where you've solved maybe one problem or you've added something to strengthen one area and you might be weakening another with any trade. They don't kind of have a reserve of stuff to get deals done without kind of just chipping away at another area to try and fix one.
Yeah, I do think that Portland 24-second is a good chip. And I think that could probably get them in some of these conversations. But, I think what people often don't consider, the trade machine users, is like, there is another team on the other end. It's not just like match salary, add one pick, and everyone's ready to dump their, some of their best players. Like, sounds like Caruso may not be available to anyone. I doubt that the Bucks pick collection could get that done. These other players, maybe, who knows? Brooklyn is a play-in caliber team right now. They're not horrible. I don't think they're trying to be bad. They don't control their own draft, so it doesn't really behoove them to be much worse. They need Houston to be worse. And you can go. I think the Tybal thing with Portland, I do think makes a lot of sense, and it's them getting their own second back when they know they're dreadful. I still have no idea how the Bucks acquired Damian freaking Lillard from Portland, and Portland didn't say, hey, we'll take our draft pick back now that we're trading the best player in franchise history, and we're going to be bad. And here they are, bad and ready to surrender the Bucks a top 33 or 34 overall pick, which, hey, maybe they'll use it. They've actually drafted pretty well in the late first and early second over these last few years. Anyway, but trading Bobby, how big has to come back, or you have to have one ready to sign because, he's your backup center / backup four right now, and even if he's not always the most playable in every matchup, if it's that or the way Robin Lopez has looked this year, you can obviously play smaller, but I don't think they want to be in a spot where they have to play Brook or Giannis the whole game. I don't think that's tenable, especially, Brook is 35. Giannis misses some games every year. Brook honestly usually plays more, but they are in a hard place to trade this year, I think, which is good because they have a deep, very good team, a great team.
There's also something with Bobby, right? Because you look at this team, and one of the jarring things that speaks to the offense, which is they have like 6 guys averaging double-digit points per game at the moment. The offense being as high-powered as it is, you don't really want to kind of chip away at those guys either. If you get rid of Bobby and you bring back someone who's not scoring, and then all of a sudden you lose a little bit of your offense. I'm saying this as someone who has always been not too shy in talking about Bobby's flaws, and we know the challenges of playing him in certain matchups in the postseason. But losing Bobby's offense when you're then an offensive first team, that's a different proposition to in the past when people might have talked about trading Bobby because of, okay, you're not getting this on defense, he can't play in certain matchups. It doesn't mean that's kind of a make or break thing, but I do think it's a slightly different consideration with the idea of if they were to trade Bobby than there would have been in the past, because the whole approach of the team at the moment and where their success is coming from is more tooled towards the kind of output you see from Bobby Portis every time he steps on the floor. So that's kind of a little bit different too. It's like the idea of, say, a more defensive wing coming in for anyone. It's like, does the defensive wing solve the defense enough that if it's going to come at the cost of anything offensively for that to make sense for this team? Like, the Bucks this year might just have to kind of live and die with the offense. That's part of, you made this trade, and of course you made this trade. You should make this trade. But I don't know on kind of deals like that around the fringes. Again, it comes down to the Bucks don't have a ton of, movable pieces that you're eager to move that other teams will want and that don't subtract anything from what you've got. That's kind of the challenge. Maybe there's a scenario where, say, we'll put the name that, like, every time Jordan and I do a mailbag, we seem to get bombarded with, which is PJ Tucker, obviously.
Oh.
Let's say if PJ Tucker got bought out.
Oh, yeah. That's a combo.
That's one where maybe if you could trade Bobby for a defensive wing, you could get PJ Tucker then. But even roster spots wise, these things are tricky, and I don't
even know if I don't think that makes you better.
I'm not sure on PJ. Yeah. I'm not sure on PJ at all. It's like he is no spring chicken. He wasn't when he was here last time, and there's been quite a bit of water on the bridge for him, and a lot of not playing, which isn't ideal. Like, we saw how long it took him to get up to speed in that championship run. So that's as much as any time there's kind of like a loss or a couple of games that aren't particularly pleasing to look at, everyone's like, oh, well, what if they trade for this guy for this? I think it's really tough to find trades that are just kind of slam dunks from the Bucks perspective, where there isn't a drawback. And the trades have to factor in, like with everything else, just the new version of the Bucks, which is an offense first team right now.
Yeah, I don't even know. And PJ has a player option for the year after this year, so I don't think a buyout is likely. Seems like he wants to play a bit, which I don't really know if he would. If you just dropped him on this, let's just say instead of Robin Lopez, let's just assume you swap him out. I mean, when Crowder's out, maybe he plays quite a bit. When Crowder's back, I don't know. And I think you also get to a point where it's like, how much better does PJ Tucker make you right now than playing Andre Jackson Jr. and Marjon Beauchamp through some of these lumps in the regular season to help grow them into guys who, whether it's this or next playoffs, can play a big role there. I know we need to be focused on every individual postseason when you have Giannis and Dame. I'm not saying to the contrary of that, but, Marjon and Andre right now are both on low sample per game, shooting above 43% from deep. I mean, these guys are giving you something defensively. They're giving you something offensively. They're spacing the floor. They're way more athletic, clearly. I don't know if there is this like silver bullet to fix the defense that's coming in. I think, as you and I have said a couple times throughout this pod, like Jae Crowder getting healthy for the bench and the defense should be a big deal. I think it's pretty exciting to just, let's see how this group develops. And I think part of maybe the reason they wouldn't want to make a trade is this is the most slapped together a Bucks team has ever been, right? Like this is a group that hasn't played together much. And, I think they acquired Drew, obviously, and made a seismic change. I think it happened, if I remember right, much earlier in an offseason than Dame coming in with just a couple weeks, 2 weeks, I think, before camp and media day. And obviously they had Drew for 3-4 straight years in a row. So there wasn't this big adjustment. So I think everyone is adjusting to Dame. I think Dame's adjusting to everyone. I think it's looking pretty good right now. He's somehow already almost pulled himself to 38% from deep. He's at 37.9 after being like between 33 and 35 for a lot of the season. It turns out, much to the chagrin of people who gave the Bucks like a B- for their offseason and wondered if they got the second or third best share of the Dame trade over the last couple of weeks here. It's still pretty good to have a Dame on your team, and it hasn't been super common yet, and I think it would probably be more common the bigger the game is, and now that Dame is kind of finding a rhythm and learning his teammates. When he and Giannis are both scoring at a high level, they're just overwhelming. I really don't know what you do. I mean, there's no defense that can take away both of those guys, and it just gets really it's just like it's been so fun to watch when like, okay, Giannis dunk, Giannis spin and put it off the glass. Okay, the defense takes that half step in, Dame pull up three from 29 feet. And it's just like, I don't know what you do. And then if Beasley or Khris is cooking, Khris has come on really playing 30 minutes a game at this point, which is very exciting too. The bench is always worth talking about. It's always a consideration. I think, especially with the way we've seen Griffin coach this year, it's probably going to be 7, maybe 8 guys playing in big playoff games. I don't think it's going to be a deep bench moment. I think the fact that we're seeing the primary players play this well, Giannis and Dame and Khris in particular and Brooke, is really, really good news for the long-term version of this Bucks team.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think we're already seeing something of, with Giannis in particular, the idea of what does Dame just being on the court do for Giannis? Like, it makes things really easy. And when he gets going, things look easier than ever. His career high franchise record night is a testament to how that can happen for him now. And why in the past, lots of big nights, but wasn't necessarily knocking on those doors too easy. It's easier with Damian Lillard out there. I wanted to talk about Khris. I've been traveling quite a bit the last couple of weeks. So I've missed quite a few games. And kind of in that time frame, Khris has started to really ramp up his minutes, and he's kind of steadily now in recent games averaging in around 30 plus minutes. So we're getting very close to just Khris Middleton being Khris Middleton in a slightly new way. I was thinking about this too. Khris used to be like something of the Iron Man kind of guy who would be leading the Bucks in minutes all the time, 42, 43 minutes. I'm going to take a guess, and this might even apply for the postseason, that version of Khris Middleton is gone, because it just has to be preservation first. And the Bucks have been so careful and diligent, much more so than honestly I ever would have anticipated. When we think of the talk like right around the start of the season about, minutes restrictions, I certainly didn't anticipate that we'd still be talking about a ramp up and how many minutes is he at now as we get to Christmas. But I thought there were so many moments against the Magic, more first half. I think he probably played a little bit better first half, but you're just like, Khris looks so smooth. He's always had an old man game, but he's starting to look a little bit older out there, and he's just like kind of aging into it really nicely in some ways. Where I was like, he is looking comfortable in being the third banana. And I know this is a conversation that's been had a lot about second option, third option. And when Drew was here, it was kind of 2A, 2B was often how that kind of went. And we'd flip back from one to the other. At this stage in his career, and certainly post the injuries he's had, it is obvious that Khris is going to be better suited to being a third option. Again, less surprisingly, but to like the kind of point I was making about Malik Beasley earlier, guy still has to kind of get comfortable with that and embrace it. And Khris is looking increasingly comfortable, where he just kind of every now and then the ball will find him, and then you're like, oh well, that's not just a guy; it's Khris Middleton. So he can kind of step in, he can hit a turnaround, a mid-range jumper, knock down a tree, he can make a play, whatever it is. But the game coming to him is something that he looks quite content with right now, and I think he's starting to look pretty good. And the idea of we'll see what his minutes ultimately get to. Like I'd love to know if I could know now by the end of the season what will be like the single game high in minutes for Khris Middleton. Like what is the furthest they'll push him at any point? I think that would be really interesting. But I just think in terms of him kind of like plotting his way around games and just kind of there's something about that with the way he plays. It obviously feels very different, but he's embracing the fact that, yeah, Damian Lillard is here. I don't have to do all of that. And it's better for me. I'm going to be a better player. I'm going to help make the team better by accepting, yeah, I'm the third guy. And my job is to, make teams pay when they forget that the third guy in this team is Khris Middleton.
Yeah, I kind of think that part of the reason the rotation is structured as it is, Khris gets not a lot. I shouldn't say a lot. Khris gets a few minutes, like early in the fourth, and I think in the second as well, where it's just him, no Dame, no Giannis. And like I think, when Adrian Griffin, the coaching staff, was drawing this up, maybe the original plan was like, well, we can have 48 minutes of Giannis and Dame, and they can still play together for quite a bit of their minutes. We should do that. But I think it's nice that they do have, it's probably, 4 or 5 minutes in each of those quarters where it's just Khris. It's probably pretty important for Khris to still get some reps as like, okay, I'm going to handle the ball a lot of the time, or the offense is going to be funneled to me at least. And there's still those possessions. And you'll see late in games, like sometimes it's the players drawing it up. Sometimes you can tell it's coaching based on how scripted or how complicated the play looks. But okay, now Khris is going to run a pick and roll with Giannis, and we're going to make sure he's involved. Like it's not like, he's I think like 13 points per game. I think the minutes have a lot to do. He's still on the season only averaging 23. So while lately he's been playing 30, that the actual averages are creeping up with that. But I think it's good that they're not just like, all right, you're Michael Porter Jr. on this team. You stand in the corner, you're an elite catch and shoot player, that's it. I think they're still getting a lot out of Khris. I think sometimes late in game, maybe getting too much, asking him to dribble through press coverage. Maybe let's avoid that specific look. I'm not saying don't give Khris the ball. Just give it to him in the half court. I'd feel a little more comfortable. But I think they've been very proactive. Like, okay, if you're going to face guard Dame from 94 feet, we'll just run the offense without your best defender, and good luck stopping Khris and Giannis. And that's been very successful for the Bucks on the whole, despite some ugly moments. But I think they've found a really good level of involvement for Khris, where it's like sometimes you run the offense, sometimes you are that super dangerous third option where, the ball comes to you as part of just an action and you're able to cook. And I remember before the season just thinking like, this is the perfect role for Khris at this stage with the injuries, as he's kind of working his way back into full conditioning, not having to put so much load on him. I mean, the worst, scariest Bucks minutes when they're healthy and they're playing their normal rotation is like, for whatever it is, 5-10 minutes a game, when all we have is the guy who closed out a finals as the pick and roll ball handler on the court. Like that's an embarrassment of riches. And yeah, I think he's looked good in that role. I think seeing his threes start to fall has been exciting, but his 2-point shot all season has been ridiculous. And it's been such a great calming presence for them. Sometimes it's like nothing's going right. Oh, here's Khris backing down someone who's 6'5" and just, banging home a couple of twos to stop the momentum. He's been so great in that role. I think defensively, still a work in progress. I kind of think they're finding better spots for him, like bigger guys. He's kind of fallen into that Harden role, I think, where it's like, all right, you can try and post him up. He's big. He's solid. He's tall. On the perimeter, it's been a little more dicey. But again, in the biggest moments, he's been at his best, even though he's still not a great defender. That's okay, though. They defend well enough with him in the lineup.
I think he's good, Ty. Honestly, I think he's better than we give him credit for. He's just slow, and he's getting slower. So it is purely, if you can do your best to keep, speedy guards off of him, he can hang with anyone. And he's not going to you're not leaving yourself exposed defensively by Khris Middleton being out there. So it is just, trying to avoid him being switched onto a really fast, smaller guard. That's where the trouble comes from. I think we've probably overcorrected to some extent because there were a couple of sequences in the Magic game where I watched him, like, that's really good defense. And we talk about so many guys, but he's got really long arms, and when he's kind of just out there and he's applying pressure, he can kind of drape himself over guys. It's not easy to get around Khris Middleton unless you can just kind of blow by him. And if the Bucks can, to the best of their ability, there's going to be times it's going to happen. And hey, look, part of that is having Brook Lopez back there as the last line of defense. And that works out, I think he's better than at this point we give him credit for. He's not the Khris of earlier in his career when he was much more mobile, much quicker. But he's a smart defender. And I think in a way, there's a play when you were talking about Pat earlier that stood out to me where Jonathan Isaac ended up, on Pat, but far enough kind of just off kind of left block, too far away to just quickly back him down. And with most guys of Pat's size, a big like that is going to be like, okay, I need to just bully my way inside here. But Pat's kind of smart enough to go, okay, I know where I am. I need to work out where's Giannis, where's Brook. And then my job is to hold my own physically for long enough that the help can get there. And I think there's an element of that with Khris too. It's like, even if it is a much faster guard, it's like, okay, well, use your wingspan, use your size, and just kind of block off angles and buy everyone time.
And
I think it's a key thing when you
funnel them toward okay, you got to go through me.
The Bucks have the individual defenders,
yeah.
So it's always about, you want to send guys, you want to funnel them, but it's like knowing where your teammates are. Are they in position? If I funnel them this way, has Brook got over in time? And part of that is being smart enough to know where you are, know the situation. And I think a big part of it is just being physically strong enough to hold your own, to add a second or two to what it takes for an opposing team to get to the spot they want, because that's all you need to get Brook there. That's all you need to get Giannis there. So obviously Khris isn't what he used to be, but I do think there's an element we've probably kind of overcorrected because he's a smart defender. He's got good physical tools outside of his speed still. And yeah, your Harden comp, I think, is a good one. I don't think he has quite that level of strength that Harden has.
Yeah, probably not.
But he can play in all the same ways, though. You'll move him easier, but he doesn't have to necessarily do just that. It's about knowing, and key to it again, the guys that he needs the help from, he has a better understanding with than most others. If he's trying to be well, where's Giannis going to be on the floor? Where's Brook going to be on the floor? He's got a pretty good idea of that. He's not new to the party. So I think all of that is looking pretty good, and I'm feeling pretty confident about it. I mean, the other thing with Khris, I don't know if you remember before the season, Jordan tweeted out the photo of Kareem and Oscar, the iconic photo of them, and then the Bucks, they must have seen it. People got on it. They recreated it. I didn't see any credit, but they recreated it from Media Day a couple of days later with Dame and Giannis to do the kind of historical Bucks comp and to talk about Khris at this stage of career and what he can be. Those two guys together being the Kareem and Oscar allows Khris to be Bob Dandridge, who I think in terms of a style comp has always been a really solid one. And I think now at this stage in his career, it just makes sense for him to be that kind of elite third guy. I think it's looking good, and we're only really starting to get to see it as his minutes climb too. So I'm excited for by the time say we get to All-Star break, how we feel about. We'll put it as the trio, not to exclude Brook, but just how Khris is fitting in and how he's best managing to complement Giannis and Dame. I think that's kind of interesting to revisit around that time.
Yeah, it's a good thing to keep in mind too on just the slower start than maybe we had anticipated is also Khris has not played a back-to-back and was even more, was like below 20 minutes, I think, to start the year as part of his ramp-up. So that certainly is a factor as well. I want to talk more about the offense and, maybe a particular play. But first, let's talk about our friends at Sleeper. The NBA season is here, as you could probably tell from the whole start of this podcast, which means you now have a chance to 100 times your cash on daily fantasy basketball. Basketball has never been more exciting than it is now, with stars like Giannis Antetokounmpo, Damian Lillard, Khris Middleton, Malik Beasley, Brook Lopez, and more. Pick more or less on stats for these stars like points, rebounds, three-pointers, steals, double-doubles, and more for up to a 100x payout on Sleeper. Get your picks right and you could win big. Use promo code GYROSTEP, GYROSTEP, all one word, and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions do apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. Currently operational in over 25 states, including Wisconsin. Check out Sleeper today. So there's been some consternation, maybe, about the amount of Dame Giannis pick and rolls in the offense. I think part of the reason, I know why. There haven't been that many, and it is a very enticing play. I think some of the reason they haven't done it as much is they've just been more effective to have Dame and Brook, or even Giannis and Brook, run pick and rolls and have the other star operate off of them versus having Dame and Giannis do them together, and then defenses just collapse. And then I think we saw this against Indiana. Okay, we'll just funnel a bunch of shots to Brook. And if Brook isn't hitting the shots, that's a lot easier for us to live with than, Giannis dunking or Dame pulling up. But I just want your general take on, obviously the offense has performed at, again, historic levels, but how do you feel about the way they're doing it? Are they running enough stuff with Dame and Giannis, and just your overall temperature on the offense?
The offense is really good, so I don't see the reason to stress about this. I also don't see the reason to overemphasize this in the regular season if you don't have to. If this could be the wrinkle that you're not really going to over and over again, but then you build up your comfort level very kind of gradually, diligently, and somewhat quietly, where it doesn't feel like the predominant thing you're doing. And then in, clutch situations against really good teams in the playoffs, you can go to it over and over again. That seems like a game changer. I just don't think this needs to be over taught too much. I do think there are some elements to this, like Giannis is an interesting player where you do have to get some kind of feel for him because his screen setting can be substandard. It's not always his favorite thing to do. Like, Khris has built up a great understanding with Giannis in the pick and roll and knows exactly how he's going to use his body and sometimes not use his body and what that means for timing. I think there is a reason, and I know Jordan and I talked about this a few episodes ago, winning 6, that the comfort level, say, Brook and Dame have very quickly built up in pick and roll situations. So obvious. Brook sets great screens. Any point guard can go and read that, understand it, and you get your timing down. I just couldn't find it in me to be overly concerned about this because it's such an obvious thing. It's not like Adrian Griffin and, even down to the players. It's not like Dame and Giannis. It's never occurred to them, hey, we should try, doing something to the pick and roll together. I think at this point, there is probably reason to believe they're very comfortable with staying away from that and maybe holding some of that back and working out some other things. I would hope and expect that we'll see more of it gradually. I don't think in a really extreme way as the season goes on be introduced. But I don't see the issue. That doesn't have to be the way the offense functions. It's like the most obviously deadly way to pair those guys together. It's like the trade happens and it's like, oh, just wait until we're watching Giannis and Dame in the pick and roll. They're finding lots of ways to be pretty devastating together as is, and it doesn't necessarily have to come via that route. I would like to see some more of it just because I think there are occasions, and he's not a bad player to have off ball in the corner. Like if Damian Lillard is in the corner and you eventually get the kick to him, that's a really high percentage look. But at the same time, sometimes you're like, oh, Giannis is kind of barreling through kind of traffic somewhere here. And would it not be better to have Dame just a little bit closer to the action? That's where I can understand the frustration. But at the same time, I think the offense is clearly working really, really well.
Yeah, you know, that's
I
exactly
wouldn't
where
fret. I
that
wouldn't fret.
that's exactly where I want to see more, just to make sure that they have the full understanding of each other. And I think they run it. I mean, there was, fourth quarter Orlando, it just didn't really work that well. I mean, Orlando's a great defensive team, and they were up on the screen and getting at poking the ball out from Giannis. I think still the worst examples are where Giannis just rushes a little too much. I think he's got to understand the gravity of Dame means he doesn't have to go full speed on the roll. I mean, catch the ball, take a second. You're probably 4-on-3 at that point, because usually if two players don't go to Dame, he's just too wide open and defenses won't allow it. Then you can kind of, okay, do I drive? Do I kick right here? Do I throw a lob to Brook in the dunker? What is it? And there were some of those where he just was. I think some of it is because he hates Mo Wagner so much. He was like trying to move at 1,000 miles an hour and poster Mo Wagner, and it wasn't necessarily working out. But so I'd like to see some more for sure. But also, I think the offense has been great, and they've found other ways. I think the patented Giannis post up with Khris one pass away, a lot of those have morphed to doing that with Dame one pass away. And it is always just, I would say I chortle every time you see that help defender, take the extra step toward Giannis, like, oh, we can't let this happen. And then it's a skip pass to a wide open Dame catch and shoot. And it's just like, oh, you can't do that. You just literally cannot ever do that. And that's free. I mean, if they don't have a defender who can guard Giannis, and most teams don't, shout to John Isaac, who did a tremendous job, still got postered, did a tremendous job. Most teams don't have a guy who can do as well as he did. That's just like, okay, so either we let Giannis post up, we let Dame catch and shoot, or we send the help from somewhere else, and then Giannis can stand up and, oh, Bobby Portis, here's a dunk. They've had that. I think the Giannis kind of in the dunker, or like being able to crash onto the Dame Brook pick and roll, has been really effective, because, again, just Dame doing anything with anyone draws so much attention. Oh, here's Giannis catching the ball 16 feet away with a path to the rim. We know how that story ends too. So yeah, I actually think I'm encouraged that I would rather have this be the case where the Dame Giannis pick and roll, they're doing it, but it's coming along slower, but they have a bunch of other stuff, versus, okay, they have a play and they don't have anything else. They don't know what else to do. Like, I think this is better, and it's better for the team. And I like the fact that it's not just an, strictly Giannis and Dame centric offense. That said, I am heartened that, like, when he's out there, most of the time, sometimes not late, when Khris and Giannis are more involved, but Dame is like the point guard. And I think early in the year, maybe just because they were kind of letting him get his feet, move in and hit the ground after the layoff and not being able to work out with the Blazers in the summer, like they were doing, like, okay, Dame's not going to bring the ball up, Dame's not going to initiate the offense all that often, we're going to use him as a secondary. It felt like a couple weeks in the season, it was like, no, we'll let the Hall of Famer, future Hall of Famer point guard be the point guard. And it just feels like since that change is really when their offense has become pretty unfair for defenses.
I think there's something in, it's somewhat counterintuitive, because you rarely have players this good that you don't have to be thinking about putting your two most deadly weapons together to kind of target plays, shoot them. But when you're having such a high level of success without it, the advantage of, let's say, a Dame Brook pick and roll and running quite a lot of that, and maybe not going so much to Giannis, is you're drawing the opponent's defenders to Brook and Dame, and then you're creating kind of 3-on-3 situations to some extent where two of your guys could be Khris Middleton and Giannis. Like, that's the other side of it too, where if anything kind of breaks down within the pick and roll, or if kind of Brook sets a good screen and Dame decides, I'm not going to shoot, he goes to turn around, and it's like there's an easy pass. Oh, Giannis is coming behind me ahead of steam. Khris is out in the corner. Like, you're giving yourself options to have an additional play. Like, out of a pick and roll with Brook, you could have a very simple, okay, I'm going to throw a lob up high for Brook. But when Giannis and Khris aren't directly involved in that play, and they're two of the other guys out there, Dame just has like a full menu in front of him of things he can do that are just incredible luxuries for a point guard to have. Where if you focus it all around, say, Giannis, and there's also something to this when Brook is out there as well, where you want Brook, because if you're running a lot of Dame and Giannis pick and roll, your spacing it's not necessarily going to be a problem, but it could get more challenging, or you're you're really kind of forcing Brook to be out at the perimeter a lot more. And I think the more he's got older, like he's shooting the three ball pretty well at the moment. But we've seen so much of the best of the Bucks come from when they just embrace, oh, Brook can just still absolutely mash on guys inside. So I like, to some extent, when he's not in that with Dame as well, Giannis, because having Giannis and Khris as kind of auxiliary options out of a really, really high functioning pick and roll, like, it's an embarrassment of riches. What more can you want out of that? Being able to go both ways on that. It is key that they do grow comfortable and that, you know, when games are on the line, you can go Giannis Dame. And I believe they will. But I don't think it necessarily has to be like all downside, because this is not a team with just two guys, right? You've got four highly, highly skilled offensive players on the floor when your starters are out there. I think it makes sense to kind of embrace that and not get too rigid and trying to force, oh, well, we need to have, you know, Giannis and Dame. And then you're kind of more kind of closely controlling where they are on the floor. And again, to this point, Giannis, a deadly, deadly weapon in the pick and roll, but it's not necessarily like his natural habitat. He doesn't embrace that like so many other kind of bigger players in the NBA would. So I think keeping options open out of it is good too. Once it's in the arsenal, that's good enough for me, because I think we'll see it when it matters.
Totally agree. Also, the Giannis Brook pick and roll has been devastating as well. Giannis goes early sometimes and Brook gets the offensive foul, but that happened once against Orlando. But that play in particular, whether Brook is rolling or popping on that, then it's like, okay, if you send any help to that, you are going to leave one of Damian Lillard, Khris Middleton, Malik Beasley open. And, you know, Beasley's name maybe doesn't hold up with the cachet. Those other two players, I mean, what, he's 48% from deep on the year? I mean, it's been a pretty ridiculous 45 now. He dropped off a little bit. But 45% from deep, like that's not a percentage where you want to leave that guy open ever. And I will say, I would imagine on catch and shoot wide open looks, it's higher. It certainly feels higher. He's had to take some high degree of difficulty shots too in some of the lineups where it's him and, you know, some bench players or the team breaks down. And, you know, he doesn't dribble out the ball in those situations, which is a benefit. He will put the shot up, won't always go in. But that has been a fun pick and roll to watch too, just because like the tush push philosophy of just like there's too much mass here. You can't. You're 4 or 5 that you're using to guard that in a big situation. They're not as big. If they are as big, Giannis is going around them. They're not as big, and I think you get both of those guys going toward the rim, and it's just like, okay, they are either going to make a shot or they're going to get the rebound and put it home. They're just huge and strong. And again, if you get too feisty with the help, then it's Khris or Dame or Bees taking a catch and shoot three. They've done a lot of fun stuff. It's been really fun to watch the different ways they've worked offensively. Feels like they're doing a good job right now, working the ball side to side as well, and just getting the switches they want, being able to operate in space. Certainly tough to say their offense hasn't been in a good place this season. I've brought up a bunch of stuff. Adam, what's on your mind, or what have you been thinking about as you've watched this Bucks team lately? What are anything big or important that we haven't gotten to cover as much so far?
No, I think we've covered the bulk of it. I mean, I think one thing that interests me with Ajax and with Marjan is kind of it, and this goes to the conversation we were having about trades, and if you were to bring someone in and just, I guess, what kind of happens by osmosis by having to play those guys and them getting reps is that you hope, well, you know, worst case scenario, you learn about them. You're seeing real in-game NBA reps. So if they're not going to be good enough in the longer term, you will have the evidence, you'll have all of the knowledge, expertise you need to make a decision on that. I think, though, what those two guys really need is kind of what you described as Pat having on the offensive side, which is just being in the right place at the right time and kind of not getting in the way in a kind of really frantic, high energy way, which both of those guys can play in a way where that's a real strength. You want to bring that on defense, though, and you've got to find a way to be a little bit more, I guess, integrated into the offense at times. And I think they're the kind of things that it can be tough. Like one of the things I really like about Andre Jackson Jr. is the fact that I feel good about his passing. I feel he can make really, I mean, he's had a couple of incredible highlight reel passes this season, but he can make very solid passes. You're not going to worry about that. I also do think, though, he is not necessarily always where he needs to be, and that forces him to make more passes than you would necessarily want at times. So that's something with those two guys playing. I feel like Marjan, it's more up and down. I think the really good version of Marjan is a guy that if that could be found consistency, the conversation changes for the Bucks in a whole variety of ways. But I want to see those two guys just kind of pick up over time a greater understanding of positioning. And the only way you can do that is by having them go out there and play and put them in live game situations and get an understanding of here's where you should be and here's what happens when you're in the right spots, or just gives them the opportunity to, I guess, to continue improving on how they read a game in real time and figure, okay, well, if I cut here, or if I rotate over to this spot in the corner, it's kind of simple things like that I feel like are missing from those two guys to make them much better offensively and give them a greater chance of really hanging and having high impact minutes and more plentiful minutes as Bucks. So I think of things we haven't covered, that's one. Like, I like so much of what those guys bring, and it's kind of just like, well, what does the next step look like? And I think often with players like that, like with Marjan, we could talk about, oh, well, if consistency is one key to it for sure, but it's like, oh, well, if his shot was like this, we got through lots of different prospects. It's like, if they could consistently knock down this shot or consistently make this type of play, I think for those two guys, the key might just be getting a greater level of comfort to continue to improve their understanding level out there and just look more like veterans when the Bucks have the ball offensively. I think it would help all of their teammates out greatly.
Yeah, I think Marjan, it's just like in traffic and in fast breaks is where he probably needs to clean up the most. I think overall he's been pretty impressive to me on most other fronts. And again, the fact that he and Andre Jackson Jr. are both shooting the ball well, I'm encouraged by. Obviously, it's a small sample, but they both have been good at shooting in rhythm. Ajax started off not taking nearly enough open shots. He's since changed that, and there's some now I'm even like, oh, maybe you could have passed that. I'm not mad at that though. You can't have those record scratch. Oh, I don't shoot my open shots, and that just kills a possession. So it's been nice to see. And yeah, I think both guys really look well suited for this new Bucks team in a way they really probably wouldn't have on the Drew Holiday version. I mean, I think people were excited about Marjan last season anyway, and you can always use more young wings, but two athletic, defensively minded wing players under contract for the next 3 and 4 years, if you count this one respectively, is a very exciting thing. I would say the one thing I'd think about is, and this probably doesn't even, and I'm glad it's the last thing, because I don't think it's really even a topic anymore, but the idea of like, that there, to use a term Zach Lowe used, there was a mutiny against Adrian Griffin, or like there's this there's anything against him. And I look at two key moments to me of the season, which Game 5 against the Knicks when they went to drop, and coming out of the in-season tournament loss when we had the Chris Haynes story, and it's like, oh, is Dame calling something in here? And they blew out the Knicks, and they went back to drop, and the effort was outstanding to start that game. And the first game after the Pacers in-season tournament loss was Bulls, and they ended up going to overtime, but they started that game red hot. And I would say since that point, where I have the question, and I'm just talking about me here, I'm not, quoting the masses or whatever, but I had the question of like, okay, Dame, Bobby Portis is the one at the meeting, but Chris Haynes, I think we can guess probably where he got that story if we want to. Is Dame upset about his role?
We can't say that. The reality is Chris Haynes is going to be, for the foreseeable future, possibly the source for all things Bucks. He has the ins.
Tie in with Giannis as well.
To the two most important players in the team.
But it's concerning Dame not having the ball. I think it's fair to wonder if maybe that came from Dame. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think part of the reason too, earlier that week,
maybe from Dame's, I think,
Dame's
and
camp.
probably a better
Dame's
way.
camp.
Yes, 100%. I think Dame might be talking to people in his inner circle,
Yes.
and that word is kind of, and it did feel a bit like that. That's something that I don't think fans necessarily consider, or even plenty of media consider when a story like that breaks. And then in a case like this, where it can be quite simple to kind of piece together, well, where might this have come from? To then be like, does this sound like the player in question? Does it mesh with anything in terms of their body language on the floor, off the court, what they're saying publicly in the media? And none of that did with Dame.
Well, he had said to Eric Name in an article about the pick and rolls, like he thinks they should run it more. Plainly, like I don't think we're doing it enough. And then that story comes out, and I love too that in the story. So Bobby was the one who's like, we need more late game offense, and Griffin was like, yeah, I should probably script that more. And then Bobby was like, but we have to execute too. So at the time when it first came out, I remember being like, I mean, it's the only thing that's bad is this got reported. I have no issue with any of this exchange. Yes. And from that game though, Bobby has played much better and he didn't have a great game against Orlando, but over most of that homestand was outstanding and brought a bunch of energy and intensity and made positive impacts. And the one thing we didn't talk about in the earlier Bobby section was the other impact of Bobby in that Pacers game was certainly felt. I think there's a value to that as well. You are not going to punk the Bucks when Bobby Portis is on the team. But also, I would say this recent stretch, and I meant to bring this up earlier when you talked about Dame's defense, I think these last 6 games of Fiserv, this homestand, I mean, I think he's been better than expected for a lot of the year. I think there's been some lapses, but I think these last 2 weeks have been the best defense we've seen Dame play as a Buck. I think he has really stepped it up. I think he has gotten a bunch of deflections. He has been very involved. He has been working his ass off on that end. That, to me, is just the opposite of what you would expect to see, to your point just now, of a guy who's like, checked out or not buying into what the coach is putting down. And I don't want to read too much into, again, like 2 stories and, what we think or, whatever's going on. But I just think you watch this team these last, week, 2 weeks or whatever, this does not look like a team that has any negativity going on. This looks like a team that is rolling, that is bought in, that is playing hard. Their bench has let them down most of the time. But I don't think you can watch any Dame game from these last 2 weeks and go, this is anything but a guy who is bought into winning at the highest levels, which is what we thought we were going to get, and I think that's what we're getting.
There's no smoke without fire.
Yeah.
I think probably the amount of fire has been overplayed, and I get Bucks fans being anxious about it and feeding into the wider conversations about Griffin. I don't think everything is perfect. I don't think it is. It could entirely be true that, for example, if we want to say Giannis, because we know that, again, we won't get into to what extent, but to some extent, if Griffin wasn't Giannis's pick, he had his approval, whatever way we want to frame that.
If Giannis didn't hate Nick Nurse.
Maybe good on you, Giannis, with good reason. At this point in the season, though, it's entirely possible that Giannis is kind of looking at it and being like, this isn't quite what I thought, or maybe this guy isn't as good as I thought. And he's only had a certain number of coaches in his career, and he's only really had, I think, one good coach, which is maybe a key part of that too, to any extent. And I think it's one thing at the end of last season, like Bud's message had clearly just worn out, and it was time for the change. I think the time since has made that clearer than anything. That doesn't mean that, a few months into a new spell, there could be some element where it's like, yeah, that thing we used to do, I like that. Like, that's all just kind of part and parcel. That's a natural part of, it's not even just a professional sports, like any role where someone has a boss, where they're under a certain style of management, and then that changes, right? I will say what I've said really since the hire. I'm not convinced. I don't know that Adrian Griffin is a good coach. What I increasingly think, though, is he may not have to be a good coach. Like, these players are so good. All he has to do is do a lot of simple things, to listen to the players. And I do think the key thing will be he has to manage the group well. And that is maybe where there would be some concerns. But also, it seems like there is a very open policy where this team, more than other Bucks teams, it's like if things aren't working, they kick off and they tell him, hey, this isn't working. And to what extent we feel good about it or not, or I find it tough. Like early in the season, we had this with Drop, and it's like, party is like, it doesn't feel great that Griffin has to be told we should go back to Drop by the players. And the other hand, you've got to hand it to him. He's just like, yeah, let's do it. That's what you guys want. That's what we do better. Let's do it. And there's an element of that too, and it's like you're not running enough structured offense. And he just comes out and he was like, yeah, I should probably do some more of that. Like there are both sides of that coin where I'd be concerned at the fact that in some ways it's like this stuff just occurs to him when he's told, and the other hand, he's just like getting on with it when he is told, and the Bucks are winning games. It might take that. That might be it. These players are good enough. There has to be a level of contentedness and trust. And I think for all of these blowups, if the fact that these blowups aren't anything terminal and they just get on with it and the coach adjusts and everyone takes those new ideas and moves forward, the trust should build to a point where they become lesser and lesser as the season goes on and everyone just kind of knows who they are and gets on with it. So I feel increasingly happy with how things seem to be playing out in terms of the situation. I don't know if that means Adrian Griffin is like some revolutionary head coach. I would at this point be leaning to the fact he isn't. He may not have to be. There have been coaches who have won multiple championships who are not like the greatest X's and O's men who have ever, graced the sideline at an NBA game. He could fall into that category. But if he gets guys to kind of just trust him, and when they see things, and if the right guys see things, I mean, this is part of it. You don't just, change things up because any player has come and said something to you. You've got to be discerning enough to be like, okay, well, that is a really important observation. That's the good observation from the right player. They're reading the game the right way. I've missed that. We've missed that as a staff. Let's change that. If he's doing that, I don't know how good he honestly has to be. I really don't. Part of that might just be if the Bucks can be healthy, these players can go and do it. Because so much of this as well, and it's as simple as that with Griffin. He might just need to be the guy who kind of oversees this project in the right way. And he's learning on the job, but it hasn't blown up completely at any point. And after all of these little things that could just be like terrible stories that begin to spell the end of the Adrian Griffin tenure, like really prematurely, the Bucks have actually got better every time.
Yeah, they're within half a game of the best record in the league. Like
they're gonna be the best. They're gonna be the best team in the league.
Yeah.
I didn't think that going into the season, but you look at it now and you're just like they're too good not to. They just find ways regardless. Like it's very hard for them to not win games sometimes. It's just a good problem to have. It's like they're gonna be the number one seed in the East unless injuries play a factor in it, I think. And he just may not have to be a genius.
I will say
we can look at coaches who've won championships. It doesn't always take that.
I think, and I appreciate how much you're calling out Steve Kerr on this podcast. But I think
I was thinking of Steve Kerr.
Of course you were. Of course you were. I think he's a good coach, and I just like lowercase g. That's been my takeaway from the year so far. I think there's some big picture things that had to be fixed, which again is a negative, but also it's a net positive that they are fixed. And I know there's this idea, I think, among the biggest Griffin detractors that like the fact that they had to, flip from back to drop is a death knell for him. But it's like, realistically for this Bucks team, does it matter now that they had a really bad defensive first 4 games because they weren't dropping? I mean, they tried in defense, didn't work. You can say it was stupid. You can say he never should have tried it. That's fine. That is the way he coached for a long time with Toronto. Tried to bring it to the Bucks. Thought it was going to be Jrue Holiday as part of that defense when he instituted it initially, which maybe it would have worked, honestly. I still think probably not, and you need to have Brook by the rim. But I think Griffin has a lot of trust in Brook, which is heartening to me because that was one of my concerns with making the coaching change over the offseason, of not to Griffin, to anyone, with Brook's free agency of like, is there going to be a new coach who wants to play a new way? Are they going to let Brook go? They didn't. They won the bidding war and kept Brook with Houston. But I would say
I think Brook is a good example too, because I think maybe Griffin didn't realize he was going to have to, embrace Brook to the level he has. but you learn quick, right?
Yeah.
You get in, you try to start doing stuff with this team. You're like, oh god, if I want to get some stops, I want to win some games. That guy's important, and like that's kind of like he's just really pragmatic so far.
Yes.
That is the word, and maybe that's just actually what they wanted. Like Bud is like I don't want to call Bud a philosopher. He is a coach with philosophies, though, right?
100%.
And
Yeah.
for good and for bad, and I think they make the most like interesting coaches on paper. It's when you can be like, oh wow, and we know when stuff worked, like some of the core principles at their best. Like the Bucks as a franchise may never see some better spells of basketball than like when Bud's offense was singing in the way it was orchestrated. Now over time, that went away. It didn't work. Maybe coming out of all of that, the whole idea, and it could have been behind the scenes, and we spent a lot of time talking about, well, what is Adrian Griffin's idea going to be? What's his defense going to be? And they made a trade, and we talked about the trade as the thing that kind of disrupted all of that. We don't actually know, though, that part of the plan wasn't, this guy isn't someone who's just coming in and being like, this is how I'm going to coach. This is my grand vision. His grand vision might have been, I'm going to do whatever it takes to win with this team.
Yep.
And
put him
whatever
in the
adjustments that takes.
Put him in the
If there's things from the Bud era that are going to be essential to this team continuing to win, I will do that. And I will find new things that will help further with that, and I will do them. And if something isn't working, I will just change it. And over again, like that is what we're seeing so far. That is like more management than coaching, I think, to kind of take a wider view of it. Like I'm not necessarily feeling and seeing the impact of Griffin, the X's and O's coach, or really anyone on the staff. That doesn't feel like kind of at the core of what we're seeing with the Bucks yet. We're seeing better players than ever. I mean, I think that goes without saying. And we're seeing them generally and gradually more and more being put into positions to succeed.
Well, I would say
that's interesting.
I think defensively, what he's done is probably the most encouraging from the schematic point of view of just, I mean, to your point, they use more different kinds of defense than Bud ever did. And it's not to say that's not better or worse, but I think, and I made this comment on the last pod, I actually didn't really get yelled at it because I specifically said I am not speaking to the quality of coach, but merely the style. And I think Griffin is more of a Ty Lue style of coach in that adjustments. That's, I think, what Ty Lue is best known for. Ty Lue is very adaptable. The Clippers, I think more so the Cavs. I think the Clippers, there's only so many ways you can play maybe with that team, but you know they'll have an entirely different kind of defense. They'll throw out things you haven't seen before. All these sorts of ideas. I've been heartened by the fact that they have worked on all these different defenses. Seemingly they've gotten better at all of them as the season has gone on. And I think Bobby Portis had a good quote after one of these recent games, maybe the Spurs game, of just like he said they're taking a big picture approach, right? Like they are playing defensively for the long run, and they're working on a lot of different things, and they feel good about kind of having these other pitches, so to speak. So I think it's going to come together. I am not, Griffin for coach of the year. It would be hilarious if he does sneak into the convo. I mean, if they're first in the NBA, a first-year head coach having the number one record in the league is usually up there. I wonder, like, how drastic would the Bucks' dominance have to be for him to be a top 3 finisher? Is it even possible?
I don't think it's possible because I think this year, if the Bucks have the best record in the league, the award they're going to win is Executive of the Year.
Oh yeah,
I think you'll get
that makes sense.
That's tough on Griffin too because that trade also did kind of change things. When he was hired, he could have been the guy who came in and the Bucks looked better than ever, and all the credit goes to him. All of a sudden, that trade gets made.
That's true.
If that happens, the credit goes to Dame and the credit goes to John Horst.
Yeah.
So that's kind of it's closer to kind of a zero-sum game for Griffin in that regard. He might be a finalist, but I don't
even think he will. I feel like people already
the Bucks would have had to win like 75 games to have had a chance
for him to finish third. Really, I think. For him to finish third. Yeah. Anyway, I think it's a good conversation to have. I think I'm heartened that I've seen it less happening just because, frankly, they've just been too good. I am a little worried that the next time they have a somewhat ugly loss, it's going to be again like, oh, this is because Griffin messed up, which I think a lot of the time, it's not. Can
I talk on the discourse? Which is what I like to do.
We're late. So yeah.
We're about to wrap up.
Yeah.
I've seen too many people do the opposite of what was happening before. In like the last week, I'd be like, I hold my hands up. I was wrong, Griffin. I just everyone chill out. You don't
Yeah,
need to
we can just
go.
watch the games too.
I mean, we're the idiots that have to talk into microphones and put ourselves out there. If you're a Bucks fan, like, just go watch the games. You don't have to get married to the idea of Griffin is a failure or Griffin is a success. It's like, we're early in the season. We haven't got to Christmas Day yet. Watch the games, continue to form your opinion, and see where the season brings us. I just think there's like this constant desire to be on one side of the conversation with them. It's just not needed. It's like, it's an evolving situation. We're still gathering intel in terms of watching games, seeing what is it like, what do the numbers look like, still getting players back healthy to see how all of it fits together. I just think there's no need. Everyone just watch the games and have fun while they're certainly this good offensively and playing this well.
Yeah, and I think especially, I mean, it's just like trying to draw a conclusion, even now, but certainly like a week, 2-3 weeks into the season and being like, oh, they're not doing the right things. It's like they're clearly building to something, and they're still building to something. I just think is important. Anyway, as you mentioned, the Bucks play on Christmas. Here is their schedule for the next week. This is just frankly insane. Tomorrow, which is Saturday, the Bucks play in New York against the Knicks at 11:30 a.m. On Christmas, on Monday, they play in New York against the Knicks at 11 a.m. So congratulations, Adam. You've got a couple of games that'll be on in reasonable hours to watch. I don't know why they're in the same place against the same team. That is frankly bizarre, but 2 straight day games against the Knicks. Then they
Rangers home game at night, or some sort of, I don't know, Disney on Ice Christmas spectacular or something.
It must be something. That's a great call. It has to be something because they don't usually do Saturday matinees.
It's a double booking. There's a double booking there.
Then they're in Brooklyn to play the Nets, so a long 6-day stretch in New York at 6:30 on Wednesday. Friday in Cleveland. This is a diminished game than probably we would have expected after the recent Cavs injury news. And then back-to-back Pacers games on New Year's Day and on Wednesday, January 3rd. New Year's Day in Milwaukee, then they go to Indiana. So fair bit of it's New York and then Central Division. A little bit of a road trip, 5 of the next 6 away from Fiserv Forum, but I don't think any of them look like world beaters. The Pacers, they'll always have being runner-up in the in-season tournament. They have not had much to hold their hats on after that. And again, Cavs with injuries. The New York teams are, they're just fine. They're just okay. So not an easy stretch, but certainly 6 winnable games for the Milwaukee Bucks.
Kind of a dumb schedule, Quirk, having all 4 games against the Pacers in the spell of a month.
Yeah.
But ultimately one that could really pay off in the fact that like there could be this fun rivalry where we suddenly hate the Indiana Pacers for the foreseeable future. So that's kind of cool.
I don't think that I don't think these games are going to be as intense as some people do after the last cut. There's been so much time has passed now, and just so much other stuff has happened. But I do think,
but you could get an incident 2 minutes into the first game.
Oh yeah,
right. Like, let's say Giannis gets hit hard a couple of minutes into the game. First one's a Fiserv, Bucks get their back up, and all of a sudden, like, all that stuff is right to the forefront again. Like, it's fun for something at the beginning of January to have to watch.
Oh, yeah. I think the NBA might actually do this more often going forward because of this. And obviously, with the IST, we had the 5th game with the Bucks and the Pacers, too. So plenty of times to play Indiana this season, but it has worked out. I think the Bucks won both of these, to be honest with you. I think the way they talked going into and coming out of the last Pacers game, I don't know if they're done imparting their will on Indiana. So we'll see how that goes. But I think that's all we've got for this one.
I've got one very brief thing. I'm going to make it very brief.
Go for it.
2024 Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame class was announced, the ballot, on what day are we? On Thursday?
Yes.
Couple of notable former Bucks on the ballot. Terry Cummings is among those in the mix as the North American nominees. And once again, which is it the 4th time now, Marcus Johnson is among this class. If anyone watched the Bucks Magic game on Bally Sports Wisconsin, you probably saw the conversation about this at the end. You may have kind of, even Marcus, rather than saying if, did say when. And Lisa made a joke about that. This really is as good a chance as Marcus Johnson is going to have to get in the player category. It's a pretty weird class in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
It's something that probably between Gyro Step winning 6 over a number of years now, we've made the case for Marcus, and I do think he ultimately deserves to be in there. He's kind of a borderline case, like individually and with his college accolades, he deserves to be in there, but it's kind of tough in a given year. If he comes up against superstars, like he admitted himself he kept last year, he just hasn't got a chance.
He was like, they had Kobe and Dirk. I knew I wasn't going in there.
This year, in terms of that kind of profile of guy, it's only really Vince Carter, who's kind of is a weird Hall of Fame case in his own regard. I'm sure he is going in, but it's that's a tough one. It's an interesting one. And then when you look kind of over time, you've got a lot of like Bill Laimbeer, Michael Cooper, Sean Marion. Like, these are not numbers guys. These are not necessarily all-stars. I think Marcus is going to go in this year.
I hope so.
Ahead of that. I think this is the year he's going to go in. I know Bucks fans would be ecstatic about that. He remains as popular, more popular probably than ever, due to his work on the broadcast. But I do think this year we should, and hopefully we'll see Marcus Johnson get in. I think finalists, is it finalists? I don't know if they cut it down again, or is it the actual ballot? But the next kind of cut down is in February, I believe. Early in February. So keep your fingers crossed for that, but I do think this might be the year for Marcus.
I certainly hope so. So can you I know there's been the question asked, like, could he get in because of his broadcast work? That is a whole separate category, right? So
not in this. I was trying to find it just before we started to think this. So there is a set number of times you can be put forward as a finalist, as a player. And I think Marcus is getting very close to that.
Yeah.
If that wasn't to happen, he would then move to the contributor category.
Yeah.
Which would factor in his playing days, but also his broadcasting work. I do think he's guaranteed to eventually get in that way, if not. But getting in as a player is the real kind of test of who you are. And I do think he deserves that, and this seems like the good opportunity for it.
That's what I thought.
He could get in as a contributor down the line, but this is, as a player, he is still being nominated at the moment and is in the kind of the short list right now.
It would be great because I think that's really the last honor Marcus has left to check off. He's got the number retired by the Bucks. You know, he's going to the Basketball Hall of Fame. Certainly rooting for it. So fingers crossed. We will, obviously, any developments, continue to cover them. As you mentioned, I mean, since the blog days, we have been adamant that Marcus is an all-time great among the Bucks and the NBA. So anytime he gets his recognition for that is outstanding. Also should be in the Broadcasting Hall of Fame someday too, because he is terrific. He's got some time to go to continue to prove that case, but certainly is just unbelievably fun to listen to on the Bucks broadcast, and such a great steward of this era of Bucks basketball in that way as well. All right, well, I think all listeners should go into the GSPN Hall of Fame. If you've hung with us until this point, appreciate you. Make sure to subscribe and rate and review, if applicable, wherever you are listening, so you don't miss a single episode. And check out Cruising for a Bruising, where you can hear more of Adam on there as well. I think the Dodgers have spent $1 billion in the last week, so fun time for baseball, really good for the game. But was it Eric Haas? Is that the guy's name?
Right, look at you.
The Brewers answered. The Brewers answered in kind. So really exciting time. No, I do think Jackson Chourio, everything else, and we'll see what happens with Corbin Burns. But make sure to check out Cruising for a Bruising. Talk of the Tundra. I think there's a special collab episode either out now or coming out soon with Andrew Snyder. I've heard he was relatively in pocket for that, but still an outstanding listen, as always, on that podcast and wherever you can find Andrew. Of course, also on Cruising for a Bruising. Make time for this, you and Andrew, covering all sorts of things in the world of film. I have not watched a new movie in quite some time, so I do not have any references to make there, but it's a great show.
Christmas is coming. Maybe you'll do some catch-up.
I need to. I think I'm going to watch Barbie soon. Haven't seen Barbie yet, so I'm looking forward to that. But check out all those shows. Check out our show. Appreciate it. You can find all the links at gspn.info as always. Thank you for listening. Pod Random. We will talk to you next time.